Okay, let's start. So, for those of you who don't know, Chris Day is a research fellow and stable isotope lab manager at Oxford Earth Sciences, as well as the EPIC group leader, that's environmental proxies in karst, and what he'll talk about today. Yeah, Chris is involved in almost every aspect of the speleothem science, from paleoclimate reconstructions, paleo-rainfall, rock weathering, development of novel proxies, in situ, cave calibration, karst modeling software, but he's mostly known as that Oxford cave guy, where he uses the cave to calibrate different proxies, mostly his seminal papers on oxygen, carbon, and trace elements, and a plethora of other interesting things that he will tell us about today in his talk, exploring trace and minor elements in speleothem palaeo-environmental reconstruction, which is slightly different than, yeah, pretty much the same thing. Okay, everyone, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Yuval, for the introduction. Thank you very much to Cecile, Nikita, Kirsten, everybody for the opportunity to give this talk. So, yeah, I think I've renamed it slightly to Exploring Elements, Trace and Minor Elements in Speleothems for Paleo-environmental Reconstruction. And yes, obviously this follows some very in-depth, very nice in-depth talks by Andreas, by Sylvia, and also by Jasper. So I guess I was just trying to pick a few topics that fit alongside what many of them have already talked about. So just briefly in these opening slides, I guess the main theme of my talk is that I will be focusing on elements such as magnesium, strontium, and barium, but also calcium isotopes. But I just wanted to acknowledge that in this particular science, there's a huge number of elements to choose from, and there's also a huge number of applications. So too many to actually cover in detail, of course, but this is one of them by Sebastian Höpker. And I think it looks really exciting and promising. Essentially, it's the use of the rate of dissociation for transition metals for quantitatively reconstructing drip rate. So, to my knowledge, that is fairly recent, and it's certainly something that I'm excited by. And then there are so many additional and other studies going on, such as this one by Carol Tedros et al., published recently in 2018. And this is showing some of the other controls and some of the other things that speleothems can be recording in terms of their trace elements. So their drip solution measurements show, for example, the atmospheric input on the sodium measurements, but also that potassium fixation that's taking place in the soil might also be visible in drip water. So a huge number of opportunities, but also at the same time, these represent challenges, because of course we need to be able to separate out these different controls. And yes, this little bit of text below here is taken from their abstract. And I think it really, I guess it summarizes this talk quite neatly, actually, because I will be focusing on magnesium, strontium, and barium, which is what a lot of studies focus on. But in addition to magnesium, strontium, and barium, I will be introducing calcium isotopes, because they do actually allow for a more quantitative reconstruction of PCP, and therefore rainfall at the same time. And I'd just like to acknowledge also that all of this work, whether it's with barium, with strontium, with magnesium, and more recent work on calcium isotopes, it all builds on this concept of prior calcite precipitation. And that's work that was pioneered by Ian Fairchild, Andrea Borsato, and co-workers as early as 2000. So it goes back a long way. So a brief introduction to the mechanism involved here. So it's that equation in the top left-hand corner. So we have the trace element, which is represented by X. So the trace element to calcium ratio is controlled by a small number of factors. So dx, which is the partition coefficient, and it's simply a measure of whether the element X wants to be incorporated in the solid or the solution. In order to understand the evolution of the trace element to calcium ratio, we also need to know the value of the initial solution. So that's the value of the trace element to calcium ratio prior to calcite precipitating from the solution. And the variable F is simply the fraction of calcium remaining in solution. So in many cases, we have partition coefficients that are different from 1. And as a result of that, the trace element to calcium ratio within the speleothem evolves along Rayleigh fractionation curves, which is what we have illustrated here in the right-hand side. So it's a figure from the Day and Henderson 2013 paper, and I kind of added it at the last minute just to help myself really to visualize the evolution and the behavior of trace elements in speleothems with, with different partition coefficients. So we've got magnesium at the top here. That partition coefficient is less than 1, and it's really quite distinct from 1. As a result of that, it has a relatively steep slope, at least steeper than strontium, for example, where the partition coefficient is also less than 1, but it's less distinct from 1. And then we have these interesting elements such as cadmium. In this case, it has a partition coefficient which is greater than 1 and quite significantly so. And as a result, it's very sensitive to changes in prior calcite precipitation. So we can see this in graphical form in this figure from Rob Owen's paper in 2016. And essentially what we can see is in the top part of the system within the soil zone, we are adding calcium to the solution by dissolving bedrock. So we have the calcium concentration increasing here within the middle of the figure. And as we go down through the system, degassing occurs, precipitation of calcite occurs either within small voids or within the cave itself. As calcite precipitates, we're reducing the calcium concentration within the drip water. And as per the previous slide, because the partition coefficient for magnesium is different from 1, it's actually less than 1, the drip water magnesium calcium increases, and as a result, so also does the magnesium calcium ratio within the speleothem calcite. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of using trace elements in speleothem studies. And this first example is one in which we can very nicely reconstruct hydrological change. So this is work published in work by Carolyn et al., published in 2019 in Iran. So in this figure on the left-hand side at the top, we have ice core delta 18O from Greenland, and annotated as GS20, GS21, 22, and 23. We have these we see these Greenland stadial events within the Greenland ice core oxygen isotopes. And within the Beaker speleothem records from this particular study, we've got the oxygen isotopes in the middle, and then we've got magnesium calcium, strontium calcium, and barium calcium on the right. And co-eval with these, certainly if we take Greenland stage 22, for example, we see in addition to a decrease in oxygen isotopes in the Greenland ice core, we see an increase in the oxygen isotopes in the Iranian speleothem, and we see an increase in all three of those trace elements in that speleothem record. As many of you will know, there are multiple controls on the oxygen isotopes, and therefore in this particular study, the authors have focused on using three covarying trace elements, so the magnesium calcium, strontium calcium, barium calcium, and also actually the carbon isotopes, which are often ignored, but here they are used to demonstrate drying going into the Greenland stadial events and resumed rainfall coming out of the Greenland stadial events. And I particularly like these figures from that publication, partly because these cross plots, where we're plotting one element versus another, are particularly powerful for understanding whether our data set, in this case in the top left-hand corner, strontium versus magnesium, for example, whether it is responding to prior calcite precipitation or not. So plotted in grey in all of these plots is the expected trajectories for prior calcite precipitation as calculated by cave-calc, which is a modelling software tool that we will look at a little bit later on in this talk. So that is, so that grey shading is using cave-calc together with a plausible range of initial solution magnesium calcium, strontium calcium, and barium calcium values. So that is what is introducing that, that nice grey uncertainty area. And they're also actually using standard partition coefficients from laboratory experiments. And we have this nice agreement for each, for those different stadial events, we have this nice agreement between the measured points and the predicted behavior for prior calcite precipitation as based on cave-calc. And it's also helpful to pay attention to these arrows. So the continuous lines, that is the behavior moving into a stadial event. And based on the arrows, we can see that we're moving towards increased prior calcite precipitation. So a drying of conditions in Iran, in this region, as we're going into the stadial event, and the opposite is happening. So that is the dashed lines as we're moving away from the, as we're moving back out of that stadial event. So that's the first nice, powerful example of using these trace elements for hydrological reconstruction. Secondly, another study from same authors, not sponsored by them, but from the same region, different time period. And in this case, we can't actually use the same controls or the same mechanisms to understand the magnesium calcium record. And I guess it took a lot of thinking about to begin with, because magnesium calcium in this case was not agreeing with, let's say, the strontium calcium and the barium calcium. In particular, what we can observe in the magnesium calcium record, which is on the top here, top left-hand side, is that in and around what is commonly known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, we have these two events with abrupt increases followed by decreases in the magnesium calcium ratio. And there's a lot of effort to try and understand what was causing that. And eventually the interpretation, the hypothesis, is that there are two periods with abrupt increases in the amount of dust deposition above the cave. And that dust is particularly rich in dolomite, which has a very high magnesium calcium ratio, and which is explaining these abrupt shifts towards higher magnesium calcium ratios during two periods, a first period between 4.5 and 4.4, and another one between around 4.3 and 3.9. So there is support for that from marine sediment records, and you can see that in subplot 2, although those marine sediment records are at a lower resolution than the authors were able to reconstruct from the speleothem samples. So I wanted to give this second example because we're fortunate often to be able to develop these really extensive trace element data sets from speleothems, often with a huge number of different trace elements, but we really need to keep an open mind when actually deciphering them. Can we use PCP, or do we need to use, for example, an atmospheric type control that was referred to in some of the earlier talks, or do we need to use a dust control or something like that? Just trying to move to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So I'm now going to shift to talking a little bit about calcium isotopes and what they can add to what they can add to trace elements for reconstructing paleohydrology in speleothems. And there was a comment made earlier, I highlighted it in the abstract, the work by Sebastian for reconstructing, for quantitatively reconstructing drip rate. And one of the comments that they made is that it is difficult to make quantitative rather than just relative reconstructions of changing hydrology using trace elements. And that's actually something that with calcium isotopes, we can actually go a little bit further potentially than we are able to do with trace elements. So the mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms are the same. So what we can see in this, what we can see at the bottom of this figure is that the fractionation factor for calcium isotopes between the solid and the solution is slightly less than 1. So from that point of view, it's similar to magnesium, where the partition coefficient is also less than 1 in that case. So the direction of change as a result of an increasing amount of calcite precipitation is the same. So as calcite precipitates, whether it's in voids here above the cave, whether it's on stalagmites, on the cave roof, drip water calcium concentration is decreasing, whereas the calcium isotopes are increasing, just as the magnesium calcium is also increasing. So earlier we looked at the equation that was controlling the trace element to calcium ratio for the trace elements. Here we have an equivalent equation, but for the calcium isotopes instead. And really what I want to highlight here is the number of ticks that we have here on the left-hand side. So RS in this equation is essentially the calcium isotopes measured in the speleothem. So we know that because we can measure it. This value alpha, it's the isotopic equivalent to a partition coefficient. And we know that also. In this case, we measured it in Hishan Cave. So thanks to many years of modern day cave monitoring in that cave, Rob and co-authors were able to measure the calcium isotopes in the solution. They were able to measure the calcium isotopes in the solid. In this case, it was calcite grown on glass plates. And they're able to derive that fractionation factor. And we also know from Oxford cave experiments that there's relatively little variation in that fractionation factor as a result of, let's say, changes in temperatures. So we know that fractionation factor, and we also need this value called R0, and that's the calcium isotope ratio in the initial solution before that starts precipitating calcite. And we know that as well. And the reason for that is because, unlike for trace elements, calcium is a major element, and also calcium isotopes are very homogeneous within the bedrock. So as we go back through time, the isotopic composition of the initial solution is unlikely to change, and therefore we can consider that we know R0 as well. And as a result, we're able to plug those different values, RS, alpha, R0, into that equation. We derive F for the modern. So in the modern, that value is 0.63, i.e. we're precipitating on average 37% of the calcium. And we're able to use speleothem measurements going back in time to reconstruct F in the past. So it is that reconstruction which was done in this particular EPSL paper in 2016. And so now, rather than having just a relative change in PCP, we can actually define an absolute value for that. So in the modern, we had this value of 0.63, apparently. Yeah, that's right, of course, because it's going, yes. So in the modern, we have an F value of 0.63. And by measuring calcium isotopes in HS4 in the past, we can reconstruct F in absolute terms over this particular 8.2 kiloyear event. And that's the first time that's been done. So here we're reconstructing hydrological changes over that 8.2 kiloyear period. And actually, because of the incredibly valuable modern day monitoring that's been going on for over 10 years in that cave, thanks to efforts by Cha-Young Hu and his team, we're able to establish the correspondence between F and modern rainfall amount. And that has enabled, in this particular case, to reconstruct changes in rainfall over the course of that 8.2 kiloyear event. So on the right-hand side here, so on the left-hand side, we have changes in the absolute amount of PCP. On the right-hand side is a reconstruction of the change in rainfall amount. And the findings of that particular study has been backed up by recent work published in 2018 by Li et al. In 2018, which is basically checking the methodology and comparing it with 100 or more years of recent meteorological data. And related to this, Jin Liao has also made similar measurements over the 4.2, so there's another exciting record there as well. And the momentum for calcium isotopes is growing. There's an increasing number of speleothem calcium isotope records. Another very nice example here, which is also centered on the 8.2 kiloyear event. So I think from the point of view of speleothem records, essentially we really are starting to move towards quantitative responses of rainfall amount in multiple regions, all relating, in this case, to the same climate event. So that's really exciting. So I'm going to shift focus slightly to some of the modeling software tools that are available out there. And that's because I guess these multi-proxy approaches are complex. Instead of just measuring one thing and trying to understand it, we're trying to combine measurements of an increasing number of measurements. So we saw that in Stacey's 2019 study, she was combining the use of magnesium, strontium, barium, and also carbon isotopes to reconstruct hydrology. So the main software tool that I'll be talking about is cave-calc. And cave-calc is essentially modeling what I refer to as, let's say, three stages in the system. So we'll cover those. I will explain those three stages afterwards. It also models not only all of the major elements, so calcium, oxygen, and carbon, but it also models three of the trace elements at this stage: magnesium calcium, strontium calcium, and barium calcium. All of the underlying calculations are undertaken by FrigC. FrigC is a very well established and respected geochemical tool. It doesn't consider the kinetics in the system, so for example, of DIC depletion versus hydration and hydroxylation. For that, there are alternative tools available, such as iSolution and IsoCave, for example. And there is an alternative trace element modeling tool, which is iStyle, listed here in the model. So those three very nice tools, complementary tools, highlighted in red, they tend to concentrate on stage 3. So these three stages, the first one is within the soil zone, and it's concerned with the equilibration between soil gas, so CO2 respired from plant respiration, for example. Stage 2 is considering the equilibration between that soil solution and bedrock. So if the solution is acidic, for example, it's at that point that it will start dissolving bedrock. And the third stage is concerned with equilibration between that saturated solution and cave air. So this is basically just showing you a simple example of using cave-calc. In this case, the only parameters that we have entered into the cave-calc's input graphical user interface are some values for the bedrock barium calcium, the bedrock magnesium calcium, and the bedrock strontium calcium. Well, also the bedrock calcium isotopes. And then we've simply also entered 3 temperature values. And as a result of that, when we press run, essentially it's going to produce 3 models of the whole system from right up in the soil zone all the way down to the cave system. And it will provide us with 3 sets of model output for those 3 temperatures. So we can load those 3 models using this graphical user interface tool here. And we have this plotting tool, which is nice. It essentially allows us to choose whatever variables we want for plotting on the x-axis and the y-axis. So in this particular case, I've chosen carbon isotopes for the x-axis, magnesium calcium in calcite for the y-axis. And because we ran and loaded 3 models, it's going to provide results for the 3 temperatures that we input, so 15, 20, and 25. And it's going to label those curves with those 3 temperatures. An alternative is that if you don't want to use, if you want to produce your own plots, then you can save the model output either as a comma-separated variable file or as a MATLAB matrix file for producing your own plots. Okay, and this is the output that it produced, and we can see that it's quite similar in format to what was used in the GRL 2019 paper. And essentially, these plots can be generated really, really quickly, and they can be used for understanding and analyzing and just exploring different concepts, really. So, for example, the size of this arrow here, which is labeled with an asterisk, is that it's showing us the scale of the impact of those 10 degrees of temperature change on delta 13C. So it's on the order of 1 per mil. These two asterisks here, it's showing us the impact of a change of temperature of 10 degrees on magnesium calcium. So it's a relatively small impact compared to the impact of F on magnesium calcium as PCP or F changes from 0.9 to 0.36 in that case. We have a much larger difference of a much larger change from about 3.5 e to the minus 4 to about 9 e to the minus 4. So it's a nice exploratory tool from that point of view. And this is just highlighting the comma-separated variable output from that tool. So these are the magnesium calcium and calcite values that were plotted, and we plotted them against the delta 13C of the calcite. These are the F values, that is the saturation index of calcite, 12 points in the system, and those are the stages that we are considering. Okay, so the previous speakers, whether it was Andrea Bassato or Sylvia Frisia or Jasper, they all provided very nice overviews of trace elements and speleothems. So here I'm just picking certain areas where I think I can add bits of information. So here's a brief section on considering the impact of growth rate on trace element partition coefficients. So is it an important control factor or not? And that's still kind of widely debated at the moment. And it was nice to see the other speakers' views on that in the earlier talks. So strontium partition coefficients, are they sensitive to growth rate? So these blue dots are from a study by Tesoriero and Panko in 1996. And certainly if we look at their data, then what we can say for definite is that when growth rate changes by multiple orders of magnitude, then yes, strontium partition coefficients definitely respond to growth rate. And the same is true for all other trace elements. Whenever you have very large changes in growth rate, the partition coefficient tends towards 1. But what we're interested in, sorry, I'll just go back to the previous slide, but these particular Tesoriero and Panko experiments or Beaker experiments where they are mixing calcium chloride with sodium bicarbonate. And you can engineer any growth rate that you want in those scenarios just by adding more or less of those solutions. But what we need to understand in the speleothem community is what growth rates apply to our particular studies, to our particular samples. I guess a lot of the partition coefficients that I use are from my 2013 study. So if I consider the sort of full range of growth rates from my 2013 experiments are highlighted by this continuous line here. So if we consider only that range of growth rates, I guess there's 2 points that we can make. Firstly, our partition coefficients are quite different to those of Tesoriero and Panko. So there is a non-growth rate control, which has to be explaining this difference. But also, if we only consider this small range of growth rates, then we wouldn't expect to observe, and indeed we don't observe in those experiments, a growth rate effect. So what if we consider this range of growth rates here, highlighted by the dashed line. So where have I got that dashed line from? That is from this really nice study by, sorry, I haven't got it down on here, but this figure on the right-hand side is by Beaker et al. In 1998. I think I refer to it later on, but I really recommend using that study for getting an understanding of growth rates applicable to your own individual speleothems. So basically that study and this figure here, we have the growth rate on the y-axis, we have calcium concentration on the x-axis, and these different curves are providing us with the growth rates at these different temperatures. And so that is, I've simply taken that figure and I've plotted that over here. So the start of this dashed line on the left-hand side, that corresponds to a calcium concentration of around 1 millimole per litre at temperatures essentially less than 25 degrees. And these fastest growth rates on the right-hand side, that corresponds to calcium concentrations of around 6 millimoles per litre at a temperature of around 25 degrees Celsius. So certainly, so over the full range of speleothem growth rates, yes, it would seem as if we might be able to see changes in variation in the strontium partition coefficients, and that's nice, that's positive actually, because different studies do measure, they do get different results for strontium partition coefficients. So it's nice that growth rate might be able to explain that. But I think that when considering an individual speleothem, we have to be quite careful about whether the situation of your particular cave is able to induce such large changes in growth rate. And perhaps, I found that hard to believe in the past, but actually given that calcium concentration seems to have such an important impact on growth rate, then perhaps there might be effects such as intense rain events, rainstorms, that could dilute the solution quite rapidly and might induce changes in growth rate that are fast enough to be visible and recorded in the speleothem. So we have to keep an open mind about these things, but I guess the take-home message is these partition coefficients, we just have to be careful whether growth rate really is changing sufficiently to impact on the trace elements or not. So a couple of thoughts. Oh yes, here it is. A couple of thoughts on how you might evaluate growth rate for your own site. So certainly wherever you have modern day drip solutions, then wherever possible, measure the calcium measure the calcium concentration, measure temperature when you're in the cave, and use that study by Beaker et al. In 1998. It's got a couple of very simple equations. Use them to work out the surface area normalized growth rate. And use it also to, certainly if you've got monitoring over the course of a number of years, then you might also use that equation, those equations, to establish the range of growth rates that might apply to your particular cave system. And that's something that I've done here. So I've used that Beaker et al. 1998 study in their equation to relate the growth rate of my particular lithium isotope experiments here with growth rates applicable to caves. And that's what this heavier black line is showing here. That is actually the range of growth rates that's been measured from cave monitoring in 3 different caves: Bilar, Abir Cave, and Hishang Caves. So these are caves that are operating at quite different temperatures. Beaker is a cold cave. I think the temperature is around 3 degrees, which is much colder than a cave like Ishan Cave, which I think is, the average temperature might be around 20 degrees or so. And despite those large differences in environmental conditions, there's a relatively small range of growth rates in those particular cases. So that is great in the modern, that's great for the modern day. But what about a much older speleothem growth that might be dating back many thousands of years? How might we assess the growth rate applicable to our trace elements 1,000 years back in the past or 10,000 years ago or so? And that's clearly much more difficult because we can't rely on, we can't go to the cave and measure the solution and measure the temperature at that particular time. But potentially we can use this really nice work by Sylvia Frieser et al. In 2015, which shows that we can actually use crystallographic analysis to provide us with some indication of what the saturation index of calcite might have been at that point in the past. And I consider and discuss that in my lithium isotope paper in 2021. And I'm sure many of you out there might have thought about this more than me. So if there are, maybe there are other ideas for assessing and reconstructing growth rate in the past, but it's certainly something which is of value. I think penultimate topic that I'd just like to touch on. Sorry, I don't have my watch on. What time is it, Nikita?
You have 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes. Okay, great.
10 minutes including questions. Sorry.
Okay, right. I'll be able to finish on time. Thank you.
Sounds good.
So similarly to growth rate, there is also some debate as to whether temperature, for example, has an impact on the strontium partition coefficient. And I'm always keen to try and reduce, wherever possible, to try and reduce the number of controls on a particular trace element, because the less controls there are, the easier it is to interpret it, the easier it is to provide robust interpretations. So I guess all that I'm highlighting here is a table from Dane Henderson 2013. And what it's showing is this relationship. I'm going to focus on the strontium and the barium amongst others, but it's showing us the relationship between these partition coefficients and temperature for the experiments in this column on the left-hand side. And what we can see is the relationship with temperature, that slope, is actually insignificant in relationship to the uncertainty. We can see that that is the case for strontium, and it is also the case for barium, i.e. the uncertainty 0.01 is greater than the slope. That's not the case for magnesium, however. So the experiments are suggesting that perhaps strontium and barium won't respond to temperature. And that is actually what is predicted theoretically, and that's what's taken from this Rimstedt et al. Study from 1998. And those theoretical studies are considering the chemical potential in the solid compared to the solution. So in both cases, from theoretical considerations and based on experimental results, we might expect that there is either no impact of temperature on strontium and barium, or at least a very small impact. And if that's the case, that would be good news for our trace element work in speleothems. And there's a slide or a couple of slides in Jasper's previous talk where he makes really nice observations about the impact of magnesium calcium on the strontium partition coefficient. namely that with increased amounts of prior calcite precipitation, the magnesium calcium ratio in the calcite is increasing. And he shows from one of his studies that that seems to, the increased magnesium calcium in the calcite appears to increase the strontium calcite, the strontium calcium ratio. So that might explain why some people believe to be seeing a temperature impact on strontium partitioning. So finally, I'd just like to point out, because I think it might be helpful to the CISAL group of researchers, that so my study in 2021, which was published in GCA, the focus of it was on lithium isotopes. But as part of that study, and actually thanks to measurements that I got from Yuval, I was trying to better understand lithium isotopes in Sorek Cave in Israel. And based on Yuval's solution measurements in Sorek Cave, I realized that the magnesium concentrations were quite a lot higher. So I did a separate set of experiments where I increased magnesium concentration. So, and as a result of that, I actually grew, so there's 3 rows here. The first row, which I grew calcite, those are my standard Oxford Cave growth conditions. The second row was when I was trying to imitate growth in Sorek Cave. And finally, the third row is when I had even higher magnesium concentrations in solution. And there I was mimicking some existing Beaker experiments. But anyway, fortuitously, as a result of that, I grew aragonite in one of those experiments. And I was measuring the trace elements and everything. So we kind of have these partition coefficients for free from for lithium, magnesium, cobalt, strontium, cadmium, barium, and uranium. So there they are there on the screen, and you can calculate them alternatively from tables 1 and 2 in that particular study. And finally, in my final slide, I'm just going to show that there's really nice agreement between those somewhat fortuitous measurements in that lithium isotope study and all of the work that Jasper has been doing using a different approach. So the main figure here is from Wassenberg et al. 2016, and it's showing us the aragonite partition coefficients applicable to speleothem growth for magnesium, strontium, barium, and uranium. And because it's based on past speleothem growth, it's using a clever approach using calcite aragonite transitions to establish those partition coefficients. And there are multiple values which are all in reasonable agreement with each other. So those are these measurements 1 to 7, all from the Wassenberg 2016 study. And all that I've done is on top of that, I've added these blue circles, which are the partition coefficients derived from that lithium isotope study in the using the Oxford Cave. And it's nice that there is such close agreement between Jasper's approach of using calcite aragonite transitions in natural speleothems and the cave-analogue results that you can see with these blue circles here. There are additional experiments that have been conducted by Chris Beaker in the Oxford Cave. They're unpublished at this stage, but hopefully work by Chris. I know that Nikita is working on aragonite partition coefficients, obviously Jasper is as well. So hopefully amongst all of us, we can achieve what Jasper was talking about at the end of his presentation, which is increasing the number of experiments and increasing our understanding of aragonite partition coefficients and the controls on trace elements in aragonite speleothems, because there's a fair number of them around the world. So that's all I wanted to say, and thanks very much for listening.